This past Friday, pursuant to the Epstein Files Transparency Act, the Department of Justice was supposed to release all of the Epstein files, with minimal redactions, of course, to protect the information and identity of nearly 1,200 survivors. But the Department of Justice violated that law. Pam Bondi broke the law. She did not release all the files. She actually released a very small portion of the files and said they're going to release them on a rolling basis, which the law doesn't allow for. And what they did release is heavily redacted. And they're even going in now and pulling stuff out that was released yesterday. It's a mess. But sources even told Fox News that the Department of Justice redacted politically exposed individuals and government officials with as much care as they redacted information about the survivors, which they were not supposed to do. Hundreds of pages are fully blacked out in this release. I mean, that's why they gave up this past spring when they locked 1,000 FBI agents in a building and forced them to redact Trump's name from the files, because they knew releasing the files with that many redactions would look really bad. It would prove that they were complicit in a cover-up. So they scrapped the whole project. But among the documents that actually were released this past Friday, there's a report made by Annie Farmer's sister, Maria, to the FBI in September of 1996 about child sexual assault material, child pornography. Now, this was actually the first report about Epstein to the FBI, but the FBI sat on this for a decade before it bothered investigating the sex trafficking ring more thoroughly. And even though people called Annie and her sisters liars, even though they accused them of inventing the story from whole cloth, the FBI wouldn't even acknowledge the existence of the report, not even to Maria Farmer, who made the initial report. But Friday, when New York Times, a reporter named Mike Baker, reached out to Maria and Annie and told them that their 1996 report to the FBI had been released, they broke down in tears. I'll be speaking with Annie Farmer on today's episode of The Breakdown. Hey, everybody, I'm Allison Gill. Welcome to The Breakdown. Joining me today is Annie Farmer. Annie, you and I have been corresponding for a while on Signal. It is great to put a face to the name. Thank you for joining me today.
Oh, it's so nice to be with you. We're so appreciative of the work you've done on this story and others. And so it's really nice to get to see you.
Thank you so much. I couldn't do any of it without Julie K. Brown and her intrepid reporting of the Epstein saga that started many, many years ago. But Mike Baker at the New York Times reports, quote, "A woman who once worked for Jeffrey Epstein filed a complaint to the FBI about his interest in child pornography in 1996, about a decade before investigators began scrutinizing his predatory behavior. The woman, Maria Farmer, has for years said that she had called federal investigators in the summer of 1996, but the FBI had never publicly acknowledged her original report, even to Ms. Farmer. Now, some people following the Epstein case had accused her of inventing the story. After the release of the thousands of Epstein files on Friday, the New York Times contacted Ms. Farmer about a report stamped with the date, September 3rd, 1996, and she broke down in tears. Annie, I have a copy of this report. Let's put it up on the screen. Now, Maria's name is redacted, but it says, complainant stated she is a professional artist and took pictures of her sisters, 12 and 16 years old, for her own personal artwork. Epstein stole the photos and the negatives and is believed to have sold them to potential buyers. Epstein at one time requested Maria take pictures of young girls at swimming pools. Epstein is now threatening Maria that if she tells anyone about the photos, he will burn her house down. Annie, you were the 16-year-old sister Maria referenced in this report, and you had spent time alone with Epstein and Maxwell. Is that right? Can you tell me a little bit about your experience with Epstein and Maxwell back in the 90s?
Yeah. As you said, Maria was working for Epstein, initially hired to help him get art for his homes. And she was an artist, and that's how they met. She was introduced by the dean of her graduate art program. So of course she trusted this was an individual that, was what he said. And as she began working for him, he also, made a lot of claims about supporting young people, their pursuits, their education. And as she talked about her family, she mentioned me and wanting to go to college. And I was a junior. And so it was sort of a natural thing that, she was kind of talking about me. And he expressed a lot of interest in potentially helping me with paying for college. And so that was under the guise of why he flew me to New York the first time to meet him. And then after, a couple of interactions with him there, including one in which we went to the movies and he started holding my hand and rubbing my leg, and I was becoming, uncomfortable, but also really unsure of what to make of this behavior because it was so unexpected in the context of what I knew about him and what I understood him to be. But then I also spent a weekend at Zora Ranch with him and Ghislaine Maxwell. And during that weekend, there was further pushing of boundaries, to the point of, things I've described in more detail, but, Maxwell having me undress and giving me a massage, and touching my breasts, and, Epstein crawling into bed with me, saying he wanted to cuddle, and me like trying to figure out how to get out of that situation, and eventually, making excuses so I could go to the bathroom and get away from him. But, it was a pretty, obviously scary experience, and something that I did not initially share with my family because I didn't really even have the words to describe it or understand it. And I really, really didn't want to think about it. Like, many people who've been through a situation like this. And so, it was only after Maria was later assaulted by he and Maxwell and these photos were stolen that then my mom and sister came to me and said, what happened to you? And so, that was that. So this was the summer of 1996 that this, happened to Maria, her assault. Mine was in the spring of 96. So then she's back in New York in the fall. She makes this report, which, the report that was released obviously focuses on the images that were stolen. That was, a really horrifying thing for her. She took those for her art and she protected them. She guarded them carefully. So she was very clear on what images had been stolen. But she also reported, what had happened to her and what had happened to me in New Mexico. So as we were talking about it more today, I mean, this is, of course, incredible to have this document that finally proves that she was telling the truth about her report and that the government failed so tremendously. We were also thinking it's interesting that there is nothing, else in this report, and wondering, were there potentially two different reports taken for the different types of crimes? This one says child pornography, and it just focuses on the details of that portion of what she described. But she also talked about what happened to me. And at that time, she really didn't even know the details. So I think she reported at the time that I had been raped, which I hadn't been, but that was her fear. And so I think based on the 2006 interviews that we had with FBI, when they came and they said, we're here to follow up on your 1996 reports, they knew about my assault. They knew about her assault. They were asking us questions about those. And so it just made us think, well, there was some record of what else she said, because otherwise they wouldn't have been specifically asking us about those details. And so I think it even in this case, right, it seems like we're getting some of the information released, but not all of it. Perhaps that's because, she also mentioned having seen Trump, with Epstein. I don't know. There's just a lot to speculate at this point. But I think, this is, we want to really focus on like what a win it was that this came out. But we also, even in this case, there's, an example of what else is missing.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, I had heard that she had reported more, like you said, to the FBI. She talked about the assaults, and that, maybe you're right. Maybe there's one report for child distribution of child sexual assault material or child pornography, and then a different report for assault. Also interesting that if she mentioned Trump, why don't we have that? I mean, it's kind of clear from this release and the redactions that we're seeing from the Department of Justice that they're holding back stuff about Donald Trump. I have sources at the FBI who poured through these files and were told to keep Excel spreadsheets of mentions of Donald Trump to flag for redaction, and that there were also training videos that were embedded in PowerPoint presentations explaining to the FBI personnel how to find, flag, and log mentions of Donald Trump, among other things. And at first, they were told to do that. And most of the FBI agents pushed back and said, shouldn't we be redacting the survivors' information and their personally identifiable information? Because they were all very concerned. Everyone I talked to, Annie, was concerned that Kash Patel had asked for the complete unredacted files. They were concerned he was going to use information about survivors for retribution. Mm-hmm. And that was a real concern in the FBI when they were first going through these files this past March. But I think it's fascinating that when they contacted you 10 years later, and we'll talk about that in a second, to talk about the report that was made in 1996, they actually mentioned the other stuff, as you said, that your sister reported, but we don't see that report here. And I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to figure out why only this report was released about what Epstein had done, but perhaps the rest of the information is still being kept under wraps because of who it mentions. That is kind of really scary to think about. I mean, I'm so glad that, there's this vindication for that this original report is there, but where is the other information? They knew it when they came to you 10 years later.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's, again, this very much anticipated release. I think many people are left with more questions than answers, right? I mean, I do think it was very significant that this was flagged as child pornography at the time, because from my understanding, there were federal statutes that required a certain level of investigation of that type of crime that was distinct even than other types of child sex crimes, right? And so it's even more difficult to explain why there would have been no investigation. I mean, for us not to be contacted in any way, it just makes me think there was no investigation done at that time, or a very poor investigation if they don't contact the victims, right? And so, in some ways, the fact that this is the report that came out is also, I think, really damaging in terms of, understanding what happened here, because there was clear guidelines for how the FBI should be responding to these types of crimes.
And it was during that 2006 investigation when they reached back out to you. That was the investigation that resulted in the Alex Acosta, what we call the sweetheart deal, where he only had to plead to a couple of state charges of prostitution and got to kind of go to jail, but go home the rest of the time, where he, assaulted other people.
Yes.
What was your role in that deal? I remember reading from Julie K. Brown at the time, or, more recently, with all of her reporting, that it was actually Epstein or people representing him that paid for the lawyers of the survivors, and that you all weren't contacted about that deal. And the survivors here have been left out of this process almost at every step of the way.
Yeah, I've spoken with survivors who did have attorneys that Epstein actually hired for them during that time. And they did not really, of course, fully understand, except that they better not talk or there would be, retribution, right? And so I know that there were young women who that was their experience. Maybe they didn't really provide information because of the fear they had. And they just went along with what Epstein's attorneys suggested. That wasn't the case for Maria or I. The FBI went to Maria and basically said, we want more information now about what you reported in 1996. And then she provided them, with my contact information. They came to me. I was living in Texas at the time. And they interviewed me. And it was only at the end of that interview, when I learned, what I feared to be true, which was that there was a significant number of other victims, and that this idea of massage as a way of preying on girls had been, which it seemed so odd to me and so confusing that had been used over and over again to harm girls and young women. And so, that was how we were left. It was just sort of, will you be witnesses? we're taking your statements, we agree, we don't know what's going to happen next. And then there's really just no follow-up.
Yeah, and those details coming to light about the massages, for example, that had to bring some sort of a peace, and not in a way that the terrible things were happening. But I remember when I was interviewed about my assault for a film called The Invisible War. I'd never told my story to anyone outside of my doctors and my family, and I didn't know how they were going to use my story in the film, or if it would even end up in the film. But when I went to see the film, they used it in a supercut of all sorts of other victims, survivors, I call them, saying that they were told the exact same thing when they tried to report their sexual assaults. The same language was used. What were you drinking? Were you flirting? Are you married? Is your attacker married? Many other people were threatened with being charged with adultery because their attackers were married, for example. And when I saw that, I was, it didn't have as big of an impact as the government finally acknowledging what happened, which is, we'll talk about this in your case in a moment. But to know that I wasn't alone, and that it happened to other people, and that I wasn't crazy, that feeling of knowing that you're not alone was pretty powerful. Did you experience that when you found and heard from other survivors who had experienced the same thing?
Yeah, I think that's happened at different points in this case for me. I think, at that time, learning that those same strategies had been used, there is both like a lot of grief in knowing like, oh, nothing was done to stop this, and more, girls have been harmed. Because also, we had tried to talk to the media about this in 2002. And then, that story hadn't gone anywhere. We'd been removed from this, Vanity Fair article. And so there'd been, a couple of attempts to try and alert people. And so, now it's a few years later, and it's like, oh gosh, this has still been going on. But there also was this sense, I think, of like, kind of shame and confusion that I had about what had happened. And knowing, oh, this is just what they do. This is like a tactic, and other people have, fallen into it too. There was a sense of like, a kind of an understanding that happened with that.
Yeah. And I mean, the going back to the sweetheart deal, the idea of having your lawyers paid for by your attacker. And we've seen this time and again with Trump and his allies. They did it in January 6th when they tried to pay for Cassidy Hutchinson's lawyer, for example. We saw it with Stormy Daniels when they were trying to keep her quiet. They paid for her attorney as well. It seems like a common theme when you're trying to cover something up to hire lawyers for your victims so that they do what you want them to do. You were also left out. The survivors writ large were left out of when the Department of Justice went to the judges to unseal grand jury material. Now it's pretty banal material because it's just, a single FBI agent's testimony. It's only 76 pages, but they left you out of that process too. And it was the judge who, sua sponte, on their own, stood up and said, do you mind acknowledging the survivors here? You need to do that, and had to instruct them to do that.
Allison, it is a theme in this whole case, and you can see it continuing to unfold, right? Like, oh wait, what about the survivors here, right? I mean, it's like I think that what I felt that came out of Julie Brown's reporting in 2017, 2018, like what I felt like was really important about that was how much it highlighted, amongst other things like Epstein's crimes, of course, but also the ways that the government had failed the victims. And it has been very disheartening to see that, like, it feels like they still haven't learned their lesson. And even, with this rollout of materials, for us to know so little about what's happening, we worked so hard to get this law passed. And it seems like, okay, everyone's signed on. We're all on the same page here. We believe that transparency is best for this country, for the survivors. And then, this happens. We don't know what's coming. And what comes out is in many ways like very disappointing. So it feels like more of the same.
Right. And you and your attorneys actually wrote a letter to the judge and said, hey, just we just want to we want you to make it clear that releasing this grand jury material has nothing to do with the 300 gigabytes or whatever of information the Department of Justice has been sitting on for a long time. And I was so glad that you did that, because I knew that they were going to try to credit themselves, pat themselves on the back. We went to the Department of Justice. We went to the courts to try to release this grand jury. What do you mean? We're transparent. Check us out. We went to the courts. And that they would say, oh, if they did release it, or if they didn't, they would say, oh, the court said we can't release any Epstein files. And if they did, they would say, there, we're done. We've released the Epstein files. And you had actually, and your lawyer wrote a letter to the judge to remind the court, to remind the administration that this doesn't count for any of that.
Yes, because it does feel like so many times we haven't been included in the process, but we've also been used as like pawns or excuses, right? And so, I felt very early on in this process to support the Transparency Act that victim redactions were not being used in an honest way. That Mike Johnson saying, well, the thing is, we're just really concerned about making sure that this process protects victims. And we said it, in different rooms, like, who are these people you're concerned about? Because we're all talking. And of course, there's others that we're not in contact with, but like, we believe that this, this can be done, and that's not a good reason to delay this any further. And so, yeah, that just got kind of old, hearing that excuse over and over again.
Yeah. And another excuse was, well, Biden never released these files. But we recently learned that there was an open and ongoing investigation into uncharged third parties under the Biden administration in the Southern District of New York that was being conducted, a very sprawling investigation with multiple witnesses, multiple survivors. And in January, when Donald Trump got back into office, he shut down that investigation. He stole the files, boxed them up, and sent them to D.C., and fired the prosecutors that were involved in that investigation. Did you have any involvement in that Southern District of New York investigation? Were you part of that at all, or do you know anyone who was?
I was not part of that. I'd worked with the Southern District of New York on the Maxwell trial. Maureen Comey had been the lead prosecutor on that case, and I was very grateful for the work she'd done to get the conviction there. And as soon as she was fired, I just had a sinking feeling in my stomach about what they were up to, because I believed that it was not in the best interest of survivors, right? And obviously there were multiple things going on there. There's also this retribution towards her family and her father, but the order of events there of Maureen being fired, and then Blanche meeting with Maxwell, and I was reaching out to SDNY to say, like, what's going on? Can we get any information about what's happening here? And it was very clear that they had completely been left out of the loop. So the attorneys who had for years, investigated Maxwell's crimes, knew her in and out, had led the trial and gotten a conviction, were not being even, included in the process of approaching her for information. So highly suspicious, right?
Yeah. And, her movement to no security facility in Bryan, Texas, you were left out of that too. Nobody informed you of that. I actually was the one who released the screenshots of her point system from the Bureau of Prisons that said her sex offender status had been waived.
I remember looking at that. Thank you, Allison. Yes.
And that her custody status was out, which means you're allowed to leave the facility. And I immediately thought of Epstein's sweetheart deal, with him leaving jail every day and going to his office or whatever. And we still don't know. Well, I mean, I do know that the head of the Bureau of Prisons actually is the one who has to do that waiver. They're the only one who can. But we don't know who told him to do that. And this was just a week after Todd Blanche sat down and spoke with her. And that she was just transferred to a minimum security prison. And now she's filed a writ of habeas corpus challenging her detention in hopes that more information about her and her grand jury materials won't be released because it'll hurt her case, which is not exhausted. It totally is exhausted. It's just for them to whitewash who Ghislaine Maxwell is and was, and her crimes and her participation in the sex trafficking ring. It's just gross misconduct, gross government misconduct.
Mm-hmm. Oh, 100% agree. And yeah, I think it did seem like a very desperate move on her part, to try and slow down the release of documents, because of course she knows the more information that comes out, the worse she looks, I think less well received any kind of pardon would be. That's, I think, been our biggest fear. Once the Supreme Court decided not to take her case, right? It felt like we could all, have a short sigh of relief, but then it's like, not really, right? Because we're living in this place where criminals who have done all kinds of horrific things are being pardoned based on connection, finances, whatever, right? And so
power, money,
the same old story, yeah. And so it is something that I think many of us are worried about and feel it's important to continue speaking out about, because that would just be, I think, really devastating to not only the people that she harmed, but just really send a horrible message about these types of crimes.
Yeah, her lawyer wouldn't even sign on to that writ of habeas corpus. She had to file that pro se. Even David Marcus wouldn't touch it. He's like, it was certain things I just can't sign on to. But and we don't know. I haven't spoken to David Marcus about why he didn't put his name, or no lawyer would put their name on that particular. I didn't know if
she just run out of funds. I know she hasn't paid some of her attorneys, so I thought, maybe she just can't get anybody to work for her anymore. I don't know.
Yeah, it could be. Now, we reached out to your sister for comment, and she sent us the following. She said, "This is amazing. Thank you for believing in me. I feel redeemed. This is one of the best days of my life. Of course, it's mixed with the fact that I'm devastated about all the other little girls like Virginia who were harmed because the FBI didn't do their job. I'm crying for two reasons. I want everyone to know that I'm shedding tears of joy for myself, but also tears of sorrow for all the other victims that the FBI failed." And Annie, this reminds me of when the FBI didn't properly investigate initial allegations of sexual abuse against former U.S. Olympic gymnastics team doctor Larry Nassar. And there was a whole investigation. They brought the FBI in to Congress, questioned them. There was an inspector general investigation. And that failure to investigate by the FBI allowed his abuse to continue for another year. And there's a 10-year failure here as well. But I think what's so important is the courage that Maria had to file that initial report in 1996 as a young woman. It's not easy to do that. And, because gestures broadly, what happens to survivors when they try to report what happened to them, all the gaslighting. Annie, what was it like? If you were with Maria when you got this news, what was it like to hear that this report, at least part of it, had come out for the first time in almost 30 years?
Yeah, it was very emotional. I will say that. Mike Baker had actually sent it to me on my phone first, to confirm that he was looking at what he thought he was looking at. And he had told us, because we worked with him on, an initial story years ago, that he was going to be looking for this report right away. And so, I think we were both, when I saw it, I was like, I couldn't quite even read the words because so much emotion, coming up, but it was very clear, from the first couple sentences, oh my gosh, this is it. This is Maria. So I kind of, ran down the hall to find her. And, she was just bawling, we were just hugging and crying. And I think after so many times of being, disappointed in this fight, I think that was there was so much relief for her that people could no longer say that she was not telling the truth. And that, as you said, it was life-changing in a very negative way coming out against them. They knew that she was willing to talk about them, that she was willing to talk about what they had done, because of, the Vanity Fair story as well, like that getting them being told, Maria and Annie Farmer are talking about what happened, right? And she was, I think for people that maybe don't live in this world, it's hard to understand, but like when you are an artist in New York, she had her whole life, her little journals from 4th grade. I want to move to New York City and become an artist, right? She had pursued this dream against all odds, like moving to New York for her graduate program. I think she had like $85. It was like she made it happen, and she just like over and over again kind of manifested this life that she had imagined for herself, and had built a network of other creatives and connections, and was actually doing really well with her work. And then all this happens, and there's threats and there's fears about, about her home, about her safety. And it just became too much. And so she left it all behind. And it's like, that's not something you can easily rebuild, especially as an artist, right? There's only certain communities that can really kind of support that type of work. And so I think to have that, it just means a lot for people to understand that she did do this. And this story just of like so many people in positions of power doing nothing because it benefited them to do nothing, like to also just to provide a counterpoint, right? That there are people that are willing to put things on the line to stand up and do what's right. And so, yeah, really emotional. But again, I mean, it was like so much relief and really happiness. And then immediately, I think there's this wave of like, oh my gosh, heaviness. And I think today, to me, it's also like turning a little bit more into anger, right? Like thinking about like not just grief about all of what was done, lives that really have been lost, substance abuse, suicide, like all kinds of things that I think, we don't know how people's lives would have played out differently if these crimes had not occurred. And so there's just so much sadness around that. But I'm also today feeling like really angry, like, you knew, even just for me, you knew that these photos of me as a 16-year-old, my little sister, 12 years old, had been stolen. You say this is a federal crime and you do nothing. It's like, I think the anger is really kicking in.
Yeah, I know that anger. After a decade when the government finally acknowledged my assault, I think I had one of my therapists at the Department of Veterans Affairs set an empty chair down in front of me and said, okay, this is the person that you tried to report to. What do you have to say to them? And I went off. I was finally able to be angry. Like it let me be angry because what had happened had been vindicated. So I totally get that anger feeling. It's something I didn't know about you. You went on to help military sexual trauma victims at the Department of Veterans Affairs, as a matter of fact, to talk a little bit about that and what inspired you to get into that work.
Yeah, I in my graduate program, I had the opportunity to work at the VA, and pretty quickly into the rotation, I realized and was hearing stories about military sexual trauma and just the particular ways that it was, I guess just particularly devastating for people because of the lack of follow up and follow through by higher ups, or as even in some cases, like complete, disregard or punishment for reporting these types of crimes. And so I got kind of interested in looking at, this idea of betrayal trauma, which had been applied a lot in the context of families, and how when people that are, are supposed to be the ones that we look to for protection are actually the ones that harm us, how there's a particular type of like consequence emotionally for that. And it seemed to me like this is a type of betrayal trauma with military sexual trauma. And it can help explain why we see such higher rates of PTSD with that type of trauma, even than other types of like combat trauma and things like that. And I don't think that's like appreciated enough amongst, civilians, that like this, number one, is a very widespread problem for male and female veterans, right? Higher percentage, of course, of female veterans, but because there's so many more men serving in the military, a really high, large number of men that are victims of military sexual trauma as well. And I think the shame with all that can just be like so devastating. So, it's something that I have thought a lot about as we've talked about institutional betrayal in this Epstein case, is the ways in which, the harm that comes not just from original traumas, but from the response by those that should be protecting you, right? And that's why it is very disappointing to see over and over again the government kind of failing us in different ways, right?
Yeah, and I think that now would be a good time to pick up your 5 Calls app, everyone who's watching, contact your representatives and urge them to open an investigation into why, now that we have this document, and perhaps there's more, as you said, Annie, why they didn't do anything for 10 years. Why they sat on this for so long. I think that needs to be investigated. I think once we get the White House back, that it should be investigated criminally as well. There should be an inspector general investigation. Somebody needs to look into why Epstein was allowed to continue this behavior. And most of that behavior from 1996 to 2006 included the current president of the United States. I want to know why, and I'm sure that you do too. Nothing happened for 10 years. That's institutional failure.
And if I can add too, even in 2006, I don't know how much they looked at, it doesn't seem to me at least that they took very seriously this idea of child sexual abuse materials at that time, right? Because, many people have pointed out, that there were first of all, he got a tip, right, that people would be coming to search the home. So there were things that had obviously been removed. I've heard rumors that like some devices were even returned, right? Like that should be in FBI, it should have stayed with the government, were actually returned. And I can't, that's like recent reporting. I can't remember where I saw that, but that was pretty troubling, right? But with the types of charges and penalties that are associated with those crimes, like that would have been something that would have, he'd still be in jail, right? And there is, with what we know about the surveillance that was happening in his, in his homes, I think that there's no doubt there were all kinds of images that, would have been enough. Even when I think in 2019, I was actually at the bail hearing and they were talking about some of what they found in his safe. I believe at that time they mentioned something about images being discovered. And I don't know if these are all, of course, images of underage people, but certainly, we would, with everything we know about his particular perversion and who he was drawn to, I would imagine that there were many images of underage victims. So, I just think that part of the case has been really neglected. And I would love for people to pick up the phone and call, because I do think that's a really important question to ask.
Yeah, I agree. Annie, thank you so much for your courage and, coming on and talking to me about all of this, and please send my love to Maria and thank her for her courage as well. We now have a deeper understanding of the level, the breadth, and the scope of the cover-up and the failures, the institutional failures of the FBI, because the two of you were brave enough to speak out. So thank you so very much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure to get to talk with you.
All right, everyone. I know there was a lot of other news this week, and I'll be covering all of it on the Daily Beans. You can find it for free wherever you get your podcasts. And many thanks to Annie and Maria Farmer, and thanks to you for watching. I'm Allison Gill. See you next time on The Breakdown.
Love this video? Support independent media and unlock exclusive content, ad-free videos, and custom emojis by becoming a paid member of our YouTube channel today. You can also gift memberships to others. Let's keep growing together.